while Justin's getting things loaded up, some interesting things that I retained from Ennis's presentation is that the majority of these communities developed after emancipation, so after the Civil War. When you look at founding years, 1860s into 1870s, and this next presentation will kind of illustrate that, at least one example, with one example more clearly. Also, the idea of since emancipation did take place, many of those that had been enslaved, again, as Ennis has made clear, were looking for opportunities to make money, to survive. So they were going to, looking at areas where there was perhaps some type of industry where the individuals could find opportunities to work and earn money to support their families. And Ennis mentioned turpentine, and one of the communities that we've been working with, the commission, ourselves, of course, Ennis and Sandra as well, folks that just couldn't make it today, but Armstrong, which is about 14 miles west of St. Augustine, another one that was founded basically, built on a turpentine kind of industrial culture, and the railroads. So the railroads are often significant because these folks, again, were settling in areas that were close to industry, and of course, the movement of resources and product relied very heavily on the railroad, especially at the era we're talking about that these were founded.
And there was a lot of litigation that involved the turpentine of the railroad industry from back in the 90s.
Yeah.
So some of that stuff would be somewhere in court systems, maps and so forth.
It's funny you say that. My great-grandfather, turpentine plantation in Hamilton County.
Oh, wow.
So was a slave owner and released them after the Civil War and then hired them back. So we are at capacity. I have to keep that walkway clear. There's an empty chair here. I have an empty chair here. If we have young children, if you would please ask them to give up their seat and come sit on the floor up front so some of my older participant audience members can have a chair. For the boys and girls that are giving up their seats, thank you so much. I appreciate your great manners and your parents who have raised you. Setting a fine example. I praise when appropriate. Come on. I can't have you sitting in the doorway, sweetie. Come all the way down. All the way down. I promise you these people will not bother you.
There is
They do. They have to deal with me.
The further you come in, the more you learn.
Yes, there we go. Okay, go ahead and get comfortable. You're going to be sitting on the floor. I know it's not the best. I know you gave up your chair, and I deeply appreciate that. And so do the adults that are now getting to sit down. The older we get, sometimes the creakier we get. And I'm speaking from experience. I have an artificial knee, and they're right there with us. Okay. So I've tried to clear the pathway because if the fire marshal came in right now. Okay? All right, without further ado, thank you, Mr. Jones.
I do want to say, I appreciate everybody here at the library. It's been very helpful. Cindy and I were joking, half-hearted there, I guess, a little bit about the possibility of the attendance here. And so we said, well, good Lord, what would happen if we did get standing room only? And then she said, well, that's a good thing. And we both thought so until
we're now you're on the floor. And I apologize sincerely if you have to sit on the floor, but I thank you for taking a seat on the carpet so that the adults could have chairs. Okay? All right, I'm going to sneak back out to the hallway, and then at the conclusion, I'll come back in and say a little bit.
Please do. Please do.
All right.
So we can see our sign up there. Welcome to Cosmo, Florida. And you see as well there, a Gullah Geechee community. And then right beyond this sign, along Fort Caroline Road is another that indicates, if I can see in the background behind it, that this is has achieved its designation and is part of the corridor officially. There's been quite a bit of work done to help document the lives and history of the community of Cosmo. Very instrumental in that, there's one individual that's here today, Ms. Lynn Corley, from whom we've already heard. She conducted some, in the back there, conducted some oral histories that have been, again, very, very helpful in helping to do research, which has been ongoing. Being that I work at Fort Caroline, at least at one of the sites where I work, we're literally right down the street from Cosmo. So I've had the pleasure of working with the individuals now that are part of the Preservation Society, and one of the main driving force at this point is a gentleman who's in his mid-80s named William or Bill Truitt. Now, Bill couldn't make it today, so he passed along the presentation torch to myself. But we definitely know that he's here in spirit, and just want to acknowledge his work. But I also need to acknowledge his forerunner, a woman named Dolores Dents, Reverend Ethel Dolores Dents. And this is a presentation that I based on an article. I'm going to read this article that I think very well kind of represents the story of Cosmo, the history, and some of the ongoing efforts to preserve its culture and the livelihood of its community members. It's from the Florida Times Union. Remembering Cosmo, for about 100 years, families of former slaves made a life on East Arlington land. This is by Kristen Wilson in 2015. And forwarding, use the arrow, please. Got it. She said it once, and then she said it 2 more times. It's been hard. With the subdivision's Hunter's Run on one side and Fort Caroline Oaks on the other, holding on to her family land hasn't been easy. It's been so hard, said the Reverend Eve Dolores Dents. She then said it again. It's been so hard. Keeping up with mortgages, paying taxes, trying to understand land deals, preserving history. For about 100 years, families of former slaves settled in East Arlington and made a life for themselves in an area known as Cosmo. The area now doesn't begin to resemble the neighborhood where Dents grew up. Then, the little community was heavily wooded with a few houses, some of which were pastel colored, tucked behind the trees, off dirt roads. Dents lives in a different house on the same land today, but the neighborhood has a different look and a different name. Today it's called Fort Caroline, the neighborhood. But back then, everyone knew it as Cosmo, an area that Dents said went from St. John's Bluff Road to about Fulton Road. Residents had their own post office, church, and school. Fulton was actually another little town where the street currently is. And this is Fulton Road here, going down to the dock. Both areas had rich ties to the African American community. Deb's father was a fisherman, and that's how they lived. They got what they needed from the river or the land. So very important, that connection with the natural land and the natural resources. And respecting them. And there were plenty of wild turkeys, oysters, and fruit trees. The area known as Cosmo is near, and in some cases on, the St. John River. Prime real estate. So it wasn't long before developers came. That's what Dennis has already shared with us. Those who chose to sell and had no idea how much their property was worth, Dents said, many families look back and realize they hardly received anything for their property. She said the way it happened, how families lost their land, just wasn't right. Many were uneducated people trying to deal with seasoned land developers. They didn't stand a chance. That made it so hard. But it was even more complicated than that. And before I move on, continue on, I'm going to move on to this next slide. This is a quick interlude. We had a meeting here in the area with the commission in September. And we were able to go on a tour of Cosmo. So there's our executive director there, Heather Hodges, along with one of the community members. Now, this is someone who's here today, if I may point out, Doris White. Whom I understand, the reason I included this is because she's a master fisher person. We're going to get her with one of our National Park Service programs to help teach younger fishermen, fisher ladies, how it's done, and how it's done right. So I'm looking forward to an opportunity where we can do that. But thank you for being here, Doris. I see other family members here, so I really appreciate that. But now, as you said, it was more complicated than that. She said it wasn't uncommon for the entire community, and I thought this was really interesting, to designate one person to handle its affairs. People would chip in money and assume that the person who was supposed to be taking care of everything was doing just that. But that wasn't always the case. Families were barely surviving. They took out mortgages as a way to make things easier for themselves, so they thought, not realizing the consequences. Acreage was foreclosed upon and lost to unpaid taxes. Nobody had a bunch of money to pay taxes with, Demp said. Even after all these years, Demp can still remember her original address, Route 1, Box 290. At one point, Demp said her family had about 15 acres on both sides of what is now Fort Caroline Road. Now, the property is sandwiched between two subdivisions with a neglected, weather-beaten wooden fence that's barely standing on one side and bushes on the other. Her daughter's home is in front of hers, and she still has undeveloped riverfront property next to another subdivision. We were all Gullah and Geechee. All of us came down the St. Johns River. I think that's how my grandma got the riverfront property, but I can't prove that, she said. Now, extensive Cosmo history is hard to come by. Much of what is known is on a historical marker in front of the Alexander Memorial Methodist Church, built in 1900. And also the oral histories that Ms. Corley helped to develop and put together. The Cosmo community is located on a road that during the days of plantations led from the town of Fulton, which we saw, to St. Augustine. So residents of Cosmo traveled on a footpath to another black community located near the Mount Zion United Methodist Church, near Lone Star and Mill Creek Roads. So where those are. Here we are. And after the Civil War, this is what's actually on the marker as well. After the Civil War, freed slaves settled in an isolated area near Mill Cove on the St. Johns River. They survived by hunting, farming, mullet fishing, crabbing, and harvesting oysters. Again, taking advantage of what is offered by nature. In the heart of the community, 40 acres of land was deeded to James Bartlett on November the 7th, 1877 by the Internal Improvement Fund in the state of Florida. We do have a copy of that actual deed sitting right there behind Sandra. So that, as you can imagine, is almost a holy grail within the archives of the town, the community of Cosmo. And so the original obviously still exists. I'm not going to tell you where it is. Now, land in Cosmo was also homesteaded by William Elliott, who is buried in the oldest grave found in the McCormick Cemetery. That's located west of the Cosmo area on McCormick Boulevard. Several generations of the founding settlers are now buried in Palm Springs Cemetery, located off Fort Caroline Road in the center of the neighborhood. Now, old family names like Bartley, Williams, Buck, White, Demps, and Cody can be found there. Now, as I said, I've been working closely with Bill Truitt, who is pictured there in the photograph, with two ladies that are from a state organization known as
Florida Public
Yeah, that's right, that's FAN, Florida Public Archaeology Network. And so they actually have a training program where they, it's about preservation of cemeteries and gravestones, grave sites. And so the plan is to have a kind of a training, a workshop, and have the group come and with no charge, clean the grave markers that are there in that cemetery. So we're working with that. So just to get back to your question, there are some efforts, to help. So again, great question. The Cosmo community, excuse me. Let me get back to what it was here. Yes, located on a long road that during the days of plantation. Oh, here we are. So from 1888 to 1897, mail was dropped by the Jacksonville, Mayport, and Pablo Railroad and Navigation Company. Some may remember this as the JM&P Railroad, which I also understand also meant jump man and push. So I learned that from the post office was established in Cosmo. Of course, they all know that there is now a post office still right there in the neighborhood, right up there on that corner. That continues as far as a tradition. Now, after the Cosmo post office was closed, the mail was sent to Idlewild post office and then to Fulton. A small wooden schoolhouse, here we are, circa 1930, educated the children of Cosmo for many years. There were other education facilities that some of the youngsters did attend, but this was a main one that was, from my understanding, right on the property of another, we'll say a sacred building, which we'll show in just a moment. This is a parcel of land. Now, Dents has that information and more preserved in a folder. There's a pamphlet with all the information that they know about Cosmo, including the land deeded to James Bartley, that was part of the Southern Homestead Act. Now, this is interesting. That was passed by Congress in 1866. Again, this was the Southern Homestead Act. More than 40 million acres of land were set aside for free blacks and whites who had been loyal to the United States government. Now, about 1,000 land titles were issued to free blacks, but nowhere near the promised amounts. So the assumption is that that lease, that deed, is an extension, perhaps of that movement. But what is still a mystery is how Cosmo got its name, a very unique name. Sounds like it could be Indian, could be Spanish. We're working on it though, Dem said. And with Bill Truitt and the others, we are still trying to figure that out. So maybe one day there'll be a light that lets us know, informs us. Also in her folder is a picture of the Alexander Memorial United Methodist Church, Deb's home church. This is on the same property that was deeded, that same deeded property, and as well, I believe, where that school was. We have found actually located a later deed with the same docket number that indicates that it was the same location. So the docket numbers match and other information match what is on that deed. So that's how we're determining that this is the same parcel of land. The picture looks nothing like the current house of worship. It's much smaller, yet that didn't stop it from becoming the center of life for Cosmo. Not uncommon during the early 20th century. That's all residents had to do, Dem said. If they didn't go to church, they didn't have anywhere to go. Church services started with Sunday school at 9, then the morning service, lunch, and then afternoon services. Since there were no cars, families stayed all day. But Dem said they did leave to change clothes and go to the juke joint. Sounds like they on the same day. Sunday. Interesting. What she remembers was down the road from the church. No records, no band, just a guy playing the harmonica. So Deb is doing her best to resurrect that history, as well as other members of the Cosmo Historical Preservation Incorporated. She hopes that the land that she has directly on the river can be developed one day, but not into houses. She would rather see a park-like setting where people can learn about the area. The land she's referring to is across the street from where she lives, behind Hidden Harbor, another subdivision. She has no plans to sell to a developer who would build more houses. Just behind the subdivision, townhouses, not too far from her sits Palm Springs Cemetery, which we saw before. This is actually Reverend Brown from Alexander. Is that Waters? Excuse me, Waters. Excuse me, Waters. So just behind the subdivision, townhouses, not too far from her sits Palm Springs Cemetery. Most of her relatives are buried there. And that's where she said she wants to be when her time comes, with the rest of her family on what's left of their land. Now, sadly, Reverend Dempsey passed in early 2017. But again, the torch is continued to be carried, not only by other members of the community that are also veterans of the, living there in the culture and in the community. There's also a significant, I should say, group of veterans, U.S. military veterans, that are also within that community. So I think they should also be acknowledged and applauded. We also, though, have talked about what's next, what comes in the future. And one thing I wanted to share was Bill Truitt's daughter, Wendy. She prepared something for one of our meetings, and it just sheds a little bit of light on a question that was asked, which was by the commission. How is the culture, first of all, currently being interpreted? The settlers of Cosmo were former slaves who deeded their property in 1877 by the Florida Internal Improvement Fund. The residents of Cosmo are more directly descendants of those settlers. They host a Gullah Geechee festival every year to tell their story. And how amazing it is that in 2020 now, they have maintained their roots. They had on the original, it's held on the original land, they've held on to that. And they're worshiping in the same churches while adapting the ever-changing community around them. The desire to share their story is why they are seeking to establish a park known as Freedom Park, which again will be right adjacent to the post office, and when you're heading out there from Fort Caroline Road onto McCormick there, which would house a museum and be the beginning point for their Cosmo Gullah Geechee Freedom Trail. The trail will walk visitors through the Cosmo community and give information about the Alexander Memorial Church that was once on the grounds of their little wooden schoolhouse. Other points of interest on the trail are the Palm Springs Cemetery, where several generations of early settlers are buried, Church of the Living God, Pillar of Truth, so another church in the community that's also working with these efforts to preserve. The Fulton Dock, the boat dock area where we saw as well be part of that. Prior to roads being built, this dock served as the only means in and out of Cosmo and Fulton. Lastly, the question was, what are the gaps in our knowledge? When you said our gaps come in two ways. Gullah Geechee has become a familiar term, but there are many who do not understand that there are Gullah Geechee communities in Florida, and certainly not in Jacksonville. Yes. For the Cosmo community, even after being identified as a Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor community in 2006, being the subject of several local news interest articles, which are still coming, and having the book, Conversations from Cosmo, that Lynn put together and wrote, it still remains relatively unknown by the community which surrounds it and is largely unrecognized by the city of Jacksonville and the county of Duval. Again, kind of what we were talking about. Save for the efforts of their local representatives. So there are attempts, and there are representatives that are working with that Freedom Park initiative, in particular Al Ferraro is one. So, lastly here, the Cosmo Historical Preservation Society, in large part due to the efforts of the late Reverend Dolores Dents, has managed to collect data, pictures, and oral history from relatives of the original descendants. But because the history is mostly oral and original copies of recording of the records are missing, there are gaps in knowledge about the relationship Cosmo had with other communities in the area. This is important because it helps to show how significant the existing community of Cosmo is and how their perseverance has led to their evolution. That's so very nicely put. We have, again, some youngsters from the community in the back there. You ladies, do you mind introducing yourselves? Nothing to be shy about, you should be proud.
I'm sorry, I'm
Okay.
I'm Swati, and that's Swati.
All right. Well, glad you ladies were able to make it. I just have one question before we do open, really going to be limited questions, because I've given you about all the information I have. But for you ladies, we talk a lot about what is next, and how do we hold on to that legacy and the culture. If anything, what does the culture, Gullah Geechee culture, mean to or for you? And anything you'd like to share about maybe your feelings with that or the idea of preserving it?
I think it's a really good idea that we're trying to hold on to the history that we have, because we've got a lot that we have in the world today. And I feel like it's a really good thing that we should hold on tight to it and try to preserve as much as we could.
Very well put. Anything, or is that all right? That enough?
Like she said, we don't have a lot of this left with us. I think we should keep on putting stuff together so it'll go further with this right now.
Okay. So, yeah.
What makes sense so that
So yeah, they're basically saying, that it's important to hold on to the culture. So they're having many different ways of being exposed and things like this. That's why I made sure they came today, because I understand the importance. And so do they, because they're sitting up in here. So we're going to be working together to continue with initiatives to work toward this preservation. And we'll use their young minds to figure out what might be most effective. But they're saying that it's important to keep it going as much as they can. And there are challenges, we all know that. But there are some ways to help, because this room is full of folks who are interested in one way or another, and maybe can also contribute. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes.
Did the developer of Robin's Nest destroy the Cosmo sign, or was it preserved?
So that one that we saw.
No.
Oh, the original.
The original sign.
Yeah, that I don't know. That's before kind of my time of arrival here. So, yes.
Whatever happened to the city or to the town of Fulton?
So I guess Fulton, and maybe these folks can help to explain. Once that industry seemed to, from my understanding, it wasn't as significant in that location, then again, it may have lost its kind of significance as a settlement town. Is that true, ladies? How would you say, what would you say, Doris, to clarify that? What happened to Fulton?
Fulton is still there.
Right.
All community houses are there.
Yeah, but is it in
Real estate
name?
development.
Right, kind of in name though, right? I think you may have meant more industrially or.
Well, I speculated that when the Fulton cutoff was made, that Fulton was wiped out.
Well, as I say, there's still remnants, but I think it had a very significant impact on the way, that area was utilized before, so.